When the love of your life is gone, the world becomes a place you no longer recognize. For 67-year-old Jeremiah Briggs, that moment came when his wife of 40 years closed her eyes for the last time. He walked away from everything, his ranch, his town, his children, and disappeared into the Montana wilderness with nothing but his tools and a broken heart. The locals whispered he'd lost his mind. His family stopped searching. But deep in the ancient forest, Jeremiah was building something that would change everything. Years later, when his own daughter finally tracks him down, what she finds suspended in the trees will leave you breathless. Could a promise made in laughter become a cathedral built in sorrow? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Briggs Ranch sat in a valley where the mountains met the sky in a ceremony of stone and clouds. 40 years of marriage had worn grooves into the floorboards of the old farmhouse paths, from the kitchen to the porch, from the bedroom to the barn, from one heart to another. Jeremiah had carried Sarah across that threshold in 1983, both of them young and foolish, and so certain that love alone could weather any storm. They'd been right, mostly. Love had carried them through lean winters and broken fences, through the times when the cattle prices dropped and the times when their children tested every boundary they'd set. Love had been the foundation, and on it they'd built a life that felt as solid as the mountains themselves. Sarah kept a leather journal, brown and weathered, its pages filled with her looping handwriting, lists of things to plant in the garden, recipes she wanted to try, sketches of furniture she thought might look nice in the living room. Jeremiah had given it to her on their 10th anniversary, back when such gifts felt profound and meaningful. She'd used it faithfully ever since, documenting not grand events, but the small textures of their days together. The first tomato of summer, the way the light fell through the kitchen window in October, a joke he'd told that made her laugh until she cried. He didn't know about the journal's contents until after. Until it was too late to tell her he'd noticed, too late to say that yes, he remembered that Tuesday in March, or that story about the foal, or the dream she'd had about living in the trees. Their children had scattered like seeds on the wind, the way children do. Claire, their eldest at 42, had moved to Seattle for law school and never quite made it back. She visited twice a year, Christmas and summer, her visits growing shorter as her career grew bigger. She'd call every Sunday evening, dutiful and distant, asking about the ranch and the weather in that tone people use when they're checking boxes. Jeremiah loved her fiercely, but he'd stopped knowing her somewhere along the way. She'd become a voice on the phone, a stranger who shared his eyes. Marcus, 39, had found his way to Denver. He worked in finance, something with numbers that Jeremiah had never quite understood despite Marcus's patient explanations. Marcus came home more often than Claire, brought his wife and 2 boys to run through the fields where he'd once run. But there was a formality to those visits now, a careful politeness that hadn't existed when Marcus was young and wild and breaking his arm falling out of the hayloft. Emily, the baby at 35, lived closest, just over in Billings. She taught middle school and had her mother's gentle way with people. She'd stop by for dinner once a month, sometimes more, and those evenings felt the most like family. But Emily had her own life too, her own friends and routines, and Jeremiah understood that this was how it should be. Children weren't meant to stay. They were meant to grow and leave and build their own lives. He and Sarah had done their job well, perhaps too well. The ranch had been their real constant, 200 acres of grazing land, a modest herd of cattle, chickens that Sarah tended like beloved pets. They'd wake before dawn, share coffee on the porch, while the world turned from black to grey to gold. Sarah would head to the garden while Jeremiah checked the fences, and they'd meet back at the house for breakfast, their hands dirty and their hearts content. 40 years of this. 40 years of seasons turning, of work that never quite finished, of going to bed tired and waking up grateful. They'd talked about the treehouse on a Tuesday, Jeremiah remembered because it was the day they'd driven to town for supplies, and Sarah had seen a children's book in the general store window. The cover showed an elaborate treehouse, all rope ladders and wooden platforms nestled in an oak tree's branches. She'd laughed, touched the window glass with one finger. "Remember when we said we'd build one of those?" she'd asked. He did remember. Early in their marriage, before Claire was born, they'd picnic beneath a massive cottonwood on the property's edge. Sarah had looked up through the branches and said, "Wouldn't it be magical to live up there, among the birds and the wind? They could build a whole house in the trees," she'd said, "live like children forever." Jeremiah had kissed her and promised that one day, when they had time, when they'd finished all the practical things, they'd build her that treehouse. "I remember," he'd told her that Tuesday, holding her hand across the truck's bench seat. "We'll still build it, when we retire, when we're old and have nothing but time." She'd squeezed his hand and smiled. "We're already old, Jeremiah." "Not that old," he'd said, and she'd laughed. And they'd driven home with a trunk full of fence posts and grain and the day's groceries. That was March. By April, Sarah had a cough that wouldn't quit. By May, the cough had turned wet and painful. The doctor in town gave her antibiotics, told her to rest, said it was just a spring cold working its way through. But Sarah didn't rest. She never had. She kept working the garden, kept feeding the chickens, kept moving through her days with that steady grace that had defined her. In June, Jeremiah found her collapsed in the garden. The hospital was 2 hours away. He drove like a man possessed, Sarah unconscious in the passenger seat, her breath coming in short, rattling gasps. The doctors used words like pneumonia and sepsis and systemic infection. They hooked her to machines, pumped her full of medicine, told Jeremiah to prepare himself. The infection had gotten into her blood. Her kidneys were failing, her heart was struggling. This thing that had started as a cough had become a war her body was losing. Claire flew in from Seattle. Marcus drove up from Denver. Emily came straight from her classroom, still wearing her teacher's lanyard. They gathered in the hospital room, the 4 of them, and watched Sarah slip away by degrees. She woke sometimes, smiled at them with glassy eyes, squeezed their hands with fingers that felt like bird bones. She told them not to worry. She told them she loved them. She told Jeremiah that 40 years wasn't enough, but it would have to do. She died on a Thursday morning in late June, with Jeremiah holding her left hand and Emily holding her right. The sun was coming through the window, touching her face with gold light, and she looked at Jeremiah one last time with those eyes he'd been falling into for 4 decades. She tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Her grip loosened, her breath stopped, and just like that, the center of his world went still. The funeral was well attended. The whole town came, seemed like, filling the small church and spilling out into the yard. People spoke about Sarah's kindness, her generous spirit, the way she'd made everyone feel welcomed and seen. Jeremiah stood at the front in his dark suit, the same suit he'd worn to their wedding, and heard the words wash over him like water. None of it felt real. None of it touched the numb, hollow place where his heart used to be. They buried her in the town cemetery, beneath a cottonwood tree. Not the same cottonwood where they'd once picnicked, but close enough. Jeremiah had wanted to bury her on the ranch, in the garden she'd loved, but the law didn't allow it. So she went into the ground with strangers, and Jeremiah went back to the ranch alone. The children stayed for a week. They cleaned out Sarah's closet, divided her jewelry, sorted through her things with careful, tearful efficiency. Claire wanted to talk about the ranch's future. Marcus worried about his father living alone. Emily just wanted him to know she was there, that she'd visit more, that he didn't have to do this by himself. But Jeremiah felt himself pulling away from them, retreating into some distant place where their voices couldn't quite reach. He told them he was fine. He told them to go home to their lives. He told them he'd call if he needed anything. They left on a Sunday. Jeremiah stood on the porch and waved until their cars disappeared down the long driveway. Then he went inside, and the silence swallowed him whole. For 3 days he wandered the house like a ghost. He'd pick up objects, Sarah's coffee mug, her reading glasses, the Afghan she'd been crocheting, and hold them until his hands went numb. He'd lie in their bed and reach for her in the dark, his hand finding only cool sheets. He'd walk out to the garden and see the tomatoes she'd planted going to seed, and he'd have to sit down right there in the dirt because his legs wouldn't hold him. On the 4th day, he started going through her things in earnest. Not to clean or organize, but searching for something he couldn't name. He went through her dresser drawers, her closet, the boxes in the attic. He found old letters they'd written to each other, photographs from when they were young, ticket stubs from movies they'd seen decades ago. Each item was a small knife in his chest, but he kept looking. He found the journal in her nightstand drawer. It was the leather one he'd given her, worn soft with years of handling. He sat on the edge of the bed and opened it with shaking hands. Her handwriting greeted him like her voice, familiar and dear and gone. He read through the entries slowly, the daily observations, the small joys, the quiet gratitude she'd felt for their life together. And there, tucked into the middle pages, he found the sketch. It was crude, done in pencil with a child's enthusiasm for detail, a treehouse, not a simple platform and walls, but an elaborate village sprawling through the branches of a massive tree. Multiple rooms connected by bridges and walkways, windows with flower boxes, a spiral staircase winding around the trunk, lanterns hanging from the boughs. And at the bottom of the page, in her handwriting, "Our someday house, where we'll be young forever, where we'll watch the birds and count the stars. Love you," Jeremiah stared at that sketch until his vision blurred. He didn't remember her drawing it, didn't know when she'd added it to the journal. But here it was the dream he'd promised her, the one they'd laughed about and forgotten and never quite found time for. The practical things had always come first, the fences, the cattle, the children, the endless work of keeping a ranch alive. There'd never been time for dreams about treehouses. But there was time now, all the time in the world, an eternity of empty days stretching ahead of him. He closed the journal and sat in the silence of their bedroom. Outside, the sun was setting over the mountains, painting everything gold and purple. Sarah had loved these sunsets. She'd call him to the porch to watch them, her hand in his, both of them quiet as the day died, beautiful. He'd give anything to stand on that porch, with her again. Anything to hear her voice, to feel her hand, to have just one more Tuesday. But he couldn't have that. What he could have was this, the sketch, the promise, the dream he'd never delivered. Jeremiah stood and walked to the garage. He spent that evening going through his tools, his lumber scraps, his half-forgotten supplies. He made lists on the backs of envelopes, what he'd need, what he had, what he'd have to buy. He didn't question the impulse, didn't think about whether it made sense. He only knew that Sarah had drawn this dream, had wanted this impossible thing, and he was going to build it. He was going to build it for her. The next morning, he loaded his truck with tools and supplies. He took his camping gear, his warmest clothes, enough cash from the bank to last a while. He took Sarah's journal and her photograph and his wedding ring that he'd never once removed. He didn't leave a note for the children, didn't call to explain. He just climbed into the truck. As the sun rose, took one last look at the ranch house where they'd built their life, and drove toward the mountains. He had a promise to keep. And finally, after 40 years of waiting, he had nothing but time. The Forest Service road ended where civilization gave up. Jeremiah had driven for 3 hours into the mountains, each mile taking him further from anything resembling the world he knew. The paved road had become gravel, then dirt, then finally just 2 ruts through the undergrowth. When even those disappeared, he parked the truck and sat with his hands on the wheel, staring at the wall of trees before him. In his pocket, he carried the compass Sarah had given him for their 25th anniversary. It was an antique thing, brass and glass, with a face that had yellowed with age. She'd found it at an estate sale and bought it because she said every rancher needed to know which way was home. He'd carried it ever since, though he'd never once been lost enough to need it. Now, he pulled it out and held it in his palm, watching the needles swing and settle. North was deeper into the wilderness. Home was behind him. He chose north. It took 2 days of hiking to find the right place. He carried a pack loaded with essentials: tent, sleeping bag, a week's worth of food, and left the heavy supplies in the truck. He'd come back for those once he found what he was looking for. If he found it. Part of him wasn't even sure what that meant. A place to build, a place to hide, a place to stop feeling like his chest had been carved hollow. The forest was old growth, untouched by logging or fire. Douglas firs reached toward heaven, their trunks thick as grain silos, their branches filtering the sunlight into a green twilight. Moss grew on everything. The air smelled of earth and decay and living things. Jeremiah walked through it like a man in a dream, his boots quiet on the needle-covered ground, his breath coming easier than it had in weeks. Out here, there was no one to perform for. No one to tell him he was fine when he wasn't. No one to watch him with worried eyes and careful words. He found the grove on the 3rd day. 7 Douglas firs grew in a rough circle, their branches interweaving overhead to create a natural cathedral. The largest stood in the center, massive, ancient, its trunk so wide that 3 men couldn't have joined hands around it. Jeremiah stood at its base and looked up through the lattice of branches. Sunlight pierced through in golden shafts, birds called from the canopy, wind moved through the needles with a sound like distant water. This was it. This was where he'd build her dream. He made camp at the tree's base that first night. The tent looked small and ridiculous beneath such giants, but it was shelter. He built a fire, ate beans cold from the can, and sat watching the flames until they died to embers. Above him, the stars appeared between the branches, more stars than he'd ever seen from the ranch, a river of light flowing across the darkness. Sarah would have loved this. She'd have made him lie back and count them with her, making up stories about the constellations, laughing at his terrible attempts to find the bear or the hunter. He didn't cry. He'd cried himself empty weeks ago. Now there was just the hollow place and the certainty that he'd never feel whole again. But maybe, just maybe, he could build something beautiful to fill the space where his heart used to be. In the morning he hiked back to his truck and began the long work of hauling supplies. It took 6 trips over 3 days to bring everything he'd need for the initial construction: lumber, nails, rope, pulleys, a generator, tools. Each load felt heavier than the last, his 67-year-old body reminding him of every year he'd lived. But the pain was good, the exhaustion was a mercy. At night, he'd fall into sleep too tired to dream. Back at the ranch, Claire was the first to notice something was wrong. She'd called on Sunday evening as always. And when her father didn't answer, she'd tried again. And again. By Monday afternoon, she'd called Marcus, her voice tight with worry or anger, she couldn't quite tell which. "He's not answering," she told her brother. "I've called 20 times. I've left messages. Nothing." "Maybe he's working," Marcus offered. "You know how he gets when he's fixing fence or dealing with the cattle." For 3 days, Marcus, without checking his phone once, Marcus didn't have an answer for that. He promised to drive out to the ranch that weekend, check on things. But Claire couldn't wait that long. She called Emily, then she called the ranch's neighbors, then she called the sheriff. By Tuesday morning, a deputy was standing on the Briggs' front porch, finding an empty house and a note on the kitchen table that said only, "Gone for a while. Don't worry. Don't worry." As if that were possible. Claire was on the first flight out of Seattle. She arrived to find the Peter ranch exactly as her father had left it, doors unlocked, coffee cup in the sink, Sarah's journal open on the kitchen table. The sight of that journal made Claire's throat tight. She picked it up carefully, read her mother's handwriting, saw the sketch of the treehouse. For a moment, She almost understood, almost saw what her father must have seen in these pages. Then the moment passed, and only anger remained. He'd left, just walked away from everything, from the ranch, from his responsibilities, from them. A month after losing her mother, Claire was now losing her father too, and this loss felt chosen, deliberate. He'd decided they weren't worth staying for. "We'll find him," the sheriff promised. He was an old friend, had known Jeremiah for 30 years. He probably just needed some time to himself. Grief does strange things to people. But days became a week, and a week became 2, and there was no sign of Jeremiah Briggs. His truck was gone. His camping gear was gone. He'd withdrawn $5,000 in cash from the bank the day he'd left. The man had planned this. He'd meant to disappear. High in the mountains, Jeremiah knew nothing of his children's worry. He was too busy learning to build in the trees. The first platform was the hardest. He had to rig a pulley system to haul the lumber up, had to secure support beams to the trunk without damaging the tree, had to work 40 feet above the ground with hands that shook from effort and age. Twice he nearly fell. Once he did fall, catching himself on a lower branch that left his ribs bruised and his pride battered. But slowly, impossibly, the platform took shape. 8 feet by 10 feet, solid planks laid across sturdy beams, railings to keep him from tumbling into space. It wasn't much. It wasn't beautiful. But it was a beginning. He slept on that platform the first night it was complete, his sleeping bag laid out under stars visible through the branches. The wind rocked him like a child. The tree creaked and swayed beneath him, and for the first time since Sarah died, Jeremiah felt something other than grief. Not happiness, he doubted he'd feel that again, but purpose, direction, a reason to wake up in the morning. He pulled Sarah's compass from his pocket and set it on the platform beside his head. The needle pointed home, back to the ranch, and the life he'd left behind. But home wasn't there anymore. Home had died with Sarah. Out here in the trees, maybe he could build a new one, or at least build something beautiful enough to justify the years he had left. In the darkness, he spoke to her the way he'd done every night since she'd gone. "I'm building it, Sarah. Our treehouse, our someday house. I don't know if you can see me from wherever you are, but I'm building it. I'm keeping the promise." The wind answered, moving through the branches. The trees swayed beneath him. And Jeremiah closed his eyes and let himself believe that somehow, somewhere, she knew. 6 months changed everything and nothing. The seasons turned from summer to fall, and Jeremiah turned from a lost man into something else, a builder, a hermit, a soul suspended between grief and purpose. The single platform had grown into 3, connected by rope bridges and wooden walkways that swayed gently in the mountain winds. What had started as a desperate project now consumed his every waking hour. He worked with the same carpenter's square he'd used to build the ranch house 40 years ago. The tool was worn smooth from decades of use, its measurements faded but still true. Sarah had bought it for him at the hardware store in town, back when they were newlyweds with more dreams than money. He'd used it to frame their house, to build the barn, to construct the chicken coop and the garden shed, and 1,000 repairs in between. Now, he used it to measure beams and mark angles 50 feet above the forest floor, and every time he pressed it against the wood, he remembered her, standing beside him in the summer of 1983, holding boards steady while he cut, laughing when his measurements came out crooked. They'd built that house together, the two of them, and whatever friends they could convince to help. Jeremiah had done construction work in his 20s, so he knew the basics, how to frame walls, how to lay flooring, how to keep everything square and level. But Sarah had been his partner in every sense. She'd hammer nails beside him, her swing awkward but determined. She'd climb ladders despite her fear of heights. She'd work until her hands blistered, then work some more. At night they'd collapse exhausted in their tent, eating sandwiches and dreaming aloud about the rooms they were creating. "We'll have a big kitchen. Sarah had said, lying on her back and staring at the tent ceiling. With windows facing east so I can watch the sunrise while I make coffee. East-facing windows, Jeremiah had repeated, mock serious. I'll make a note. And a porch. A big one, where we can sit in rocking chairs when we're old. We'll be too busy for rocking chairs, he'd told her. We'll be building tree houses, remember? She'd laughed and rolled into his arms. Someday, she'd promised, when we're old and have nothing but time. Someday had arrived. He was old, he had nothing but time, and he was building her tree house alone. The work had its own rhythm now. Jeremiah woke with the sun, ate a quick breakfast of oatmeal or jerky, and climbed into the trees. He'd work until his body demanded rest, then descend to his camp for lunch and water. Afternoons brought more building, sawing, hammering, fitting pieces together like a massive puzzle. When the light began to fail, he'd come down and make dinner over his camp stove. Fish from the nearby stream, or rabbit he'd snared, or the canned goods he still had stockpiled. After dinner, he'd sit by the fire and talk to Sarah, telling her about his progress, describing the rooms taking shape above him. Sometimes he'd read from her journal by firelight, tracing her words with calloused fingers, hearing her voice in every line. The physical work had changed him. He'd lost weight, his frame going lean and ropey with muscle. His hands were torn and scarred, his back ached from the constant climbing and lifting, but he'd grown stronger in ways that surprised him. At 67, he could haul 60-pound boards up 40 feet of rope. He could balance on narrow beams, could hang from branches to install supports, could work from dawn to dusk without the exhaustion that had plagued him after Sarah died. The grief was still there. It would always be there. But out here, high in the trees with only the wind and the birds for company, it felt more bearable. He could breathe around it. Back in Seattle, Claire sat across from a private investigator named Tom Reeves. He was a former police detective, came recommended, and charged $200 an hour. Claire didn't care about the cost. She needed to find her father. He withdrew $5,000 in cash, Reeves said, reviewing his notes. Cleaned out his camping gear, his tools. He's got a 4-wheel drive truck, so he could be anywhere in the backcountry. Question is, why? Claire slid her mother's journal across the desk. This is why. He's building something, a treehouse. I don't know if he's lost his mind or if this is his way of grieving, but he's out there somewhere building this thing. Reeves studied the sketch. That's elaborate. Would take months to construct something like this. So we look for places where someone's been buying lumber, Claire said. Rural hardware stores, building supply places near forest access. Someone's seen him. Someone knows where he is. The investigator nodded slowly. It'll take time. And there's no guarantee he wants to be found. I don't care what he wants, Claire snapped, then immediately softened. I'm sorry. It's just I already lost my mother. I can't lose. Him too. The cost of Reeves's investigation created tension among the siblings. Marcus thought they should let their father be. He's grieving, Claire. He needs space. He'll come home when he's ready. Or he'll die out there alone, Claire countered. He's 67 years old, living in the wilderness, building some fantasy project. What if he falls? What if he gets sick? What if he just doesn't come back? Emily tried to mediate. Maybe we should give it a few more months, see if he reaches out. He's had 6 months, Claire said. Not a word, not a single call. We don't even know if he's alive. But Tom Reeves was good at his job. Within 3 weeks, he'd traced a pattern. Lumber purchases at a rural supply store near Glacier National Park. Always cash. Always the same man, tall, bearded, older. The store owner remembered him. Said he'd been coming in every few weeks since summer, buying boards and nails, rope and hardware. Said the man was quiet, polite, didn't talk much about what he was building. That's him, Claire said, staring at the grainy security footage Reeves had obtained. Her father looked different, thinner, weathered, with a beard she'd never seen him wear. but it was definitely him. "Where is he?" "Somewhere in the mountains east of here," Reeves said. "There are hundreds of square miles of forest. But I've mapped out the likely areas based on where he'd need to camp to reach that supply store. If you want to find him, you'll need to go looking on foot." Claire looked at the map with its circles and annotations. Part of her wanted to hike in tomorrow, track him down, demand answers. Another part wondered if Marcus was right, if their father deserved this time, this space, this strange project that seemed to be keeping him alive. "I'll talk to my brother," she finally said. "We'll go together." High in the trees, Jeremiah secured the last beam of his second platform. This one was larger than the first, 12 by 12, with built-in benches along two sides. He'd started thinking of it as the common room, the place where people could gather and talk and watch the forest stretch out below them. Not that there would be people, not that anyone but him would ever see this place, but planning for inhabitants made the work feel less lonely. He ran his hand along the smooth wood, checking for splinters. The carpenter's square had kept everything true. Sarah would be proud, or she'd think he was crazy, maybe both. Probably both. Below, 50 feet down, his campfire sent smoke curling up through the branches. Dinner would be cold tonight. He was too tired to cook, too focused to stop. The sun was setting, painting the sky in colors Sarah had loved, pink and orange and purple, fading to deep blue. He sat on his new platform and watched the day die beautiful, and for just a moment he could almost feel her sitting beside him. A year in the wilderness taught Jeremiah things he'd never learned in 67 years, of living. How to judge weight by feel, how to anticipate wind, how to work with wood that wanted to bend and twist and resist his vision. The treehouse had grown from a few platforms into something resembling Sarah's sketch. 3 main structures, connected by walkways and rope bridges, with smaller platforms branching off like rooms in a rambling house. He'd installed windows salvaged from an old church he'd found abandoned 20 miles away, their stained glass casting colored light across the wooden floors. He'd carved railings with patterns of leaves and birds, had built benches and storage chests, had created spaces that felt both wild and sheltered. The music box sat in what he thought of as Sarah's room. It was a small carved thing, no bigger than his fist, made of cherry wood that had darkened with age. He'd made it for her on their first anniversary, back when they had no money for proper gifts, and everything had to be crafted from whatever materials they could find. He'd worked on it for months in secret, learning to carve in the evenings after Sarah had gone to bed, using scrap wood from the construction of their house. The lid depicted 2 birds on a branch, and when you opened it, a simple mechanism played a tune he could never quite name. Something old and sweet and slightly melancholy. Sarah had cried when he gave it to her. They'd been sitting on the porch of their half-finished house. Only 2 rooms were livable then, and they were camping more than living. But it was their house, their land, their life taking shape. She'd opened the box and listened to the music, and tears had run down her face. "It's perfect," she'd whispered. "It's the most perfect thing anyone's ever made for me." "It's just a box," he'd said, embarrassed by her emotion. "It's not just a box. It's proof that you think about me when I'm not there. It's proof that your hands can build beautiful things. It's proof that we're going to be fine, Jeremiah. We're going to make—" They had made it. 40 years. 40 years of building and working and raising children and growing old together. 40 years that ended on a hospital bed with machines beeping and her hand going cold in his. Jeremiah had brought the music box with him into the wilderness. It was one of only 3 personal items he'd packed the box, her journal and their wedding photo. Now he set it on a shelf he'd built into Sarah's room, positioning it to catch the morning light. He wound the mechanism and opened the lid, and the tinny melody filled the space between the trees. The same song he'd heard in that hardware store 40 years ago, playing on someone's radio. The same song that had been playing in his head when he carved the birds into the lid. He stood there listening until the music wound down to silence, and he thought about how time worked, how a moment could last forever while years disappeared like smoke, how he could remember every detail of that first anniversary, but couldn't quite recall what they'd talked about the week before she died. Memory was selective that way. It kept what mattered and let the rest go. The room where he'd placed the music box was his finest work. 12 by 10 feet, with windows on 3 sides and a door that actually closed. He'd installed a small wood stove for heat, built a bed frame from bent branches, even crafted a rocking chair that hung from the ceiling by chains. The floor was made of oak he'd hauled piece by piece from the supply store, sanded smooth and finished with oil. In one corner, he'd built a bookshelf, though he had no books to fill it. In another, a small table and chair where someone could sit and write or draw or simply watch the forest live its life. It was a room made for living, made for Sarah, made for the life they'd never get to live together. 300 miles away, Claire sat in her car outside Marcus's house in Denver, her phone pressed to her ear. Tom Reeves had just sent her the final report: coordinates, maps, detailed notes about access roads and hiking trails. He'd narrowed the search area to a 20-square-mile region of old-growth forest. If their father was out there, he was somewhere in those trees. "It's a lot of ground to cover," Marcus said, studying the maps Claire had spread across his dining room table. His wife Rebecca watched from the doorway, arms crossed, clearly unhappy about this plan. "I know," Claire admitted. But Reeves talked to a forest ranger who remembered seeing smoke in this area, regular smoke, like from a campfire. "Someone's been living out there long-term." "Could be anyone," Rebecca offered. "Could be some young guy on a vision quest or a crazy prepper, or—" "It's Dad," Claire interrupted. "I know it's him." "And we have to go get him." Marcus exchanged a look with his wife. "Claire, what if he doesn't want to come back? What if we find him and he tells us to leave? Then at least we'll know he's okay. At least we'll have tried." Claire's voice cracked slightly. "I need to see him, Marcus. I need to know he's alive. I need to understand why he left." Rebecca sighed and uncrossed her arms. "When do you want to go?" "This weekend," Claire said. "Before the weather turns. We've got maybe 4 more weeks before the snow starts. After that, the whole area will be inaccessible until spring." Emily opted out of the expedition. She had school responsibilities, 2 young kids who needed her, a life she couldn't just abandon. But she made Claire promise to call the moment they found anything, and she contributed money for supplies. So it was Claire and Marcus who loaded backpacks with camping gear, food for 5 days, and printouts of the maps Tom Reeves had provided. They left on a Friday morning, driving through the mountains in Marcus's Jeep, following Forest Service roads that got progressively worse, until finally they had to park and continue on foot. "This is insane," Marcus said, adjusting his pack. "We could walk right past him and never know it. Hundreds of square miles of forest." "He's been buying lumber," Claire reminded him, "which means he can't be more than a day's hike from the supply store. That narrows the range significantly." They'd brought a satellite phone for emergencies, a GPS unit, and enough determination to power through whatever they found. Or didn't find. Claire had taken 2 weeks off work for this. She wasn't leaving until she had answers. High in the trees, Jeremiah was installing a lantern hook when he heard the distant sound of an engine. Vehicles were rare out here. The occasional forest ranger, sometimes hunters in the fall. But it was summer now, and the sound was coming from the direction of the old logging road, the one he'd used to haul his supplies. He went very still, listening. The engine cut off. Voices carried faintly through the trees, too far away to distinguish words but close enough to register as human. 2 people, maybe more. His heart began to pound in a way it hadn't since he'd arrived here a year ago. They'd found him. Whoever they were, they'd found him. Jeremiah climbed down quickly, reaching his camp and throwing dirt on the fire. If he was lucky, they'd pass by. If he was lucky, they were just hikers, just passing through. If he was lucky, He'd have a few more months before the world intruded on the cathedral he'd been building. But luck, as Sarah used to say, was a fickle friend, and Jeremiah had the sinking feeling that his year of solitude was coming to an end. The forest swallowed sound differently than open country. Claire and Marcus moved through the trees, with only the crunch of their boots on the needle-covered ground, their breathing heavy from the climb, the weight of their packs pulling at shoulders already sore from 2 days of hiking. They'd been following a creek bed, using it as a natural highway through the dense undergrowth, and now they stopped to catch their breath and check their GPS coordinates against the map. "We're close to the area where the ranger saw smoke," Marcus said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Maybe another mile north." Claire didn't respond. She was staring up at the canopy overhead, at the massive trees that had stood here long before their family existed and would stand long after. Somewhere in this wilderness, their father was living like some kind of hermit, building a dream their mother had sketched in a journal. The absurdity of it struck her again. A man of 67, alone in the forest, constructing an elaborate treehouse. It was the act of someone who'd lost his grip on reality. Or the act of someone who loved so deeply that reality didn't matter anymore. "Do you remember when he taught us to build things?" Marcus asked suddenly. He was looking at the trees too, but his expression was softer than Claire's, more wistful. "I must have been 8 or 9. He showed me how to frame a birdhouse, how to measure twice and cut. Once, Mum made lemonade and we worked in the barn all afternoon. I remember," Claire said, though she didn't, not really. Her memories of childhood had been edited down to highlights and disappointments, the way all memories eventually became. "He was patient," Marcus continued. "I kept messing up the angles and he never got frustrated, just showed me again, let me try again." He paused. "When did we stop doing things like that with them?" "We grew up," Claire said flatly. "We moved away. That's what children do." "Yeah, but we didn't just move away. We stopped calling as much, stopped visiting. I was so busy with work and Rebecca and the boys that I'd go months without thinking about them." Marcus's voice carried guilt like weight. "And then Mom died. And I realized I'd barely seen her in the last 5 years. I'd been too busy, too focused on my own life." Claire felt the words land like accusations, even though Marcus wasn't aiming them at her specifically. She'd been the same way. Worse, even. She'd called every Sunday out of obligation, not connection. She'd visited at Christmas because that's what families did, not because she was eager to spend time on the ranch. She'd loved her parents in the abstract way, you love people you're supposed to love, but she hadn't really known them, not anymore. Not for years. "We can't change that now," she said, starting to walk again. "But we can find him. We can bring him home." "What if home is here?" Marcus asked, following. "What if this is where he needs to be? In the wilderness? Alone? Building a fantasy? That's not home, Marcus. That's running away." They hiked in tense silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts and regrets. Claire remembered being young on the ranch, riding horses with her father, learning to rope fence posts, helping with the cattle. She'd been happy then, or thought she was. Then she'd gone to college and discovered a world beyond Montana, beyond ranches and rural life. She'd fallen in love with law, with cities, with the person she could become somewhere else. Coming home after that had always felt like stepping backward. She'd judged them for staying. Her parents, content with their small life in their small town. She'd thought they were limited by lack of ambition, by fear of the world beyond their valley. Now, she wondered if maybe they'd just known something she didn't, that happiness wasn't found in courtrooms and corner offices. That love was built in small daily acts, in 40 years of morning coffee and sunset porches. That some dreams didn't require a stage bigger than 200 acres and a person who knew your heart. Up in the trees, Jeremiah had retreated to his highest platform. From here, 60 feet above the forest floor, he could see through breaks in the canopy, 2 figures moving through the woods, following the creek. His forest, his sanctuary. He watched them approach with a mixture of dread and something else he couldn't quite name. Longing, maybe, or fear of the longing. He'd been working on the fifth platform when he'd heard them, a structure meant to serve as a kitchen of sorts, with a flat cooking surface and storage for supplies. The fourth platform was finished, outfitted with the wedding photograph he'd brought from home. He'd made a frame for it from birchwood, simple and elegant, and hung it on the eastern wall where the morning sun would touch it first. The photograph was 40 years old, taken on their wedding day by Sarah's uncle with a camera that was already outdated. They stood in front of the small church in town, both of them young and serious, and trying not to smile too wide. Sarah wore a simple white dress, no veil, and carried wildflowers she'd picked that morning. Jeremiah wore his best suit, the one he'd later wear to her funeral, though neither of them knew that then. They looked like children playing at being adults. They looked happy. They looked like people who believed love would be enough. He remembered that day with painful clarity, how nervous he'd been saying his vows, how his hands had shaken, sliding the ring onto her finger, how she'd cried during the ceremony, and how he'd thought he'd done something wrong until she whispered that she'd never been happier. The reception had been in the church basement, potluck food and homemade cake, and they'd danced to a crackling record player while their friends and family looked on. Later, they'd driven to the ranch in his old truck, both of them quiet with the weight of what they'd promised. To have and to hold, in sickness and health, till death do us part. Death had parted them, but the promise remained. Below him now, maybe 300 yards away, the two figures had stopped. They were looking at something, pointing, conferring. Jeremiah's breath caught when one of them turned, and he saw her profile. Claire. His eldest daughter, who lived in Seattle and called every Sunday and hadn't been home since the funeral. And beside her, Marcus, his son with the kind eyes and the apologies always ready on his lips. They'd come for him. Somehow they'd tracked him down, and now they were close. Too close. He could climb down, could walk out to meet them, could end this whole strange exile with a simple greeting. But his legs wouldn't move, his voice wouldn't work. He stood frozen on his platform, watching his children search for him, and felt the year of solitude crack like ice. They were calling his name now. The sound drifted up through the trees. "Dad! Dad! Are you out here?" And each call was a hook in his chest, pulling him toward them and pushing him away in equal measure. He'd left for a reason. He'd needed this time, this space, this project. Going back meant explaining himself, meant being told he should come home, meant returning to a ranch that would never feel right without Sarah in it. But they'd come all this way. They'd searched and worried and refused to give up. That had to mean something. Jeremiah gripped the railing and watched his children move through his forest. And for the first time in a year, he had to decide whether he was ready to be found. Claire found the camp first. The fire pit with its circle of stones, the tent pitched at the base of an enormous Douglas fir, the supplies stacked and covered with tarps. Evidence of long-term habitation, of someone who'd settled in for the duration. She stood at the edge of the camp and called again, louder this time. "Dad, we know you're here. Please come out." Marcus touched her shoulder, pointed upward. "Claire, look." She followed his gaze and felt her breath catch. Platforms and walkways spread through the branches overhead, a village suspended in the canopy. Wooden structures connected by rope bridges, windows catching the afternoon light, railings carved with intricate details. It was impossible. It was beautiful. It was exactly what their mother had drawn in her journal, but real, substantial, reaching toward the sky. "My God," Marcus whispered. A figure appeared on one of the platforms, tall and lean, bearded, moving with careful grace along a narrow walkway. Their father, older than they remembered, weathered by sun and wind and solitude. He stood looking down at them, and for a long moment no one spoke. The silence stretched between ground and canopy, heavy with a year's worth of absence. "You shouldn't have come," Jeremiah finally said. His voice was rough from disuse, from talking only to himself and to Sarah's memory. "A year, Dad," Claire said, and her voice broke on the words. "You've been gone a year, without a word, without letting us know you were alive. I left a note. Gone for a while? That's not a note, that's—" She stopped herself, took a breath. "We thought you were dead. We thought you'd walked into the woods and given up." "I didn't give up," Jeremiah said quietly. "I made a promise." Marcus stepped forward. "To Mom? The treehouse?" Jeremiah nodded. "She wanted this. We talked about it for 40 years, and we never built it. Too busy with the ranch, with raising you kids, with all the practical things. But she drew it in her journal. She dreamed about it. And now she's gone, and I have nothing but time, so I'm building it." "You abandoned us," Claire said. "You left the ranch. You left everything. The ranch doesn't need me anymore. You don't need me anymore. You've got your own lives, your own families. I'm just an old man rattling around in a house full of ghosts." The words hit Claire harder than she'd expected, because they were true, in a way. They had their own lives. They had stopped needing him years ago, stopped coming home except out of obligation. But needing and loving weren't the same thing, and she'd never stopped loving him, even if she'd forgotten how to show it. "Come down," Marcus said. "Please, let us see what you've built." Jeremiah hesitated, then nodded. He disappeared from view, and they heard him descending the creak of rope, the sound of boots on wood. When he emerged from behind the tree, Claire almost didn't recognize him. He'd always been tall, but now he seemed carved from the forest itself. Lean muscle and weathered skin, calloused hands and eyes that held something she couldn't name. Peace, maybe, or exhaustion, or the kind of grief that had transformed into something else entirely. Marcus moved first, crossing the distance and pulling his father into an embrace. Jeremiah stiffened, then relaxed, his arms coming up to hold his son. Claire watched them and felt something break loose in her chest. Then she was moving too, joining them, the three of them standing in a rough circle, holding each other the way they hadn't since Sarah's funeral. "I'm sorry," Jeremiah said into their shoulders. "I'm sorry I left. I just couldn't stay there. The house, the ranch, everything reminded me of her. I was drowning in it." "You could have told us," Claire said, pulling back to look at him. "You could have let us help." "I didn't want help. I wanted to build something, something that mattered, something that would last." He gestured upward. "Come, let me show you." He led them to a rope ladder secured to the trunk. Claire went first, climbing carefully, Marcus following. The ascent was longer than she'd expected, her arms burning by the time she reached the first platform. But when she pulled herself up and stood, looking around at what her father had created, all the exhaustion vanished. The platform was solid, the wood smooth and well-joined. Railings ran along the edges, carved with patterns of leaves and birds in flight. A rope bridge led to another platform, and another beyond that, the whole structure spreading through the tree like a web. Through gaps in the canopy, she could see more rooms, walkways, even what looked like furniture. He'd been living up here, working up here, building this impossible thing while they'd been searching for him down below. "There's 12 platforms," Jeremiah said, hauling himself up behind Marcus, "connected by 6 bridges and 7 walkways. Took me 9 months just to get the main structure stable. The rest has been details, windows, doors, furniture. I'm not finished yet. Probably never will be. There's always something more to add, something to improve." He led them across a swaying bridge to a larger platform. This one had walls, a roof, actual glass windows. Claire stepped inside and felt her breath catch again. The room was beautiful, not rustic or makeshift, but crafted with obvious care. A bed frame made from bent branches, a rocking chair hanging from the ceiling, a wood stove in one corner, a bookshelf in another, and on a shelf by the window, catching the light, a small music box she remembered from childhood. "This was Mum's room," Marcus said softly. This is Mum's room, Jeremiah corrected. Present tense, this is where she lives now, or where I can pretend she lives, where I can keep her close. He walked to the shelf and picked up something beside the music box. A silver locket on a delicate chain. He opened it to show them photos of them as babies, Claire and Marcus and Emily, tiny faces looking out from the oval frames. Sarah had worn this locket for years, until the chain broke and she'd tucked it away, meaning to fix it. She never had. It had been in her jewelry box when she died, and Jeremiah had brought it here. She carried you with her, he said, holding the locket out for them to see. Even when you were grown and gone, she carried you. She loved you more than anything in this world, except maybe me, and I loved her more than my own life. Claire felt tears running down her face. Dad, I'm not crazy, Jeremiah said. I know she's gone. I know this is just wood and nails, and my old hands trying to build something that makes sense of losing her. But up here, in this place I'm making, I feel closer to her than I did standing in our bedroom. Up here, I can breathe. I can remember her without drowning. I can build the dream we never got to live, and maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all I've got left. Marcus put his hand on his father's shoulder. It's beautiful, Dad. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And it was. Despite the impossibility of it, despite the isolation and the grief that had driven its creation, the treehouse was beautiful. A cathedral built in sorrow. A promise kept too late. A love made visible in wood and glass, and the endless patience of a man with nothing left to lose. Stay, Jeremiah said suddenly. Stay tonight. Let me show you the rest. Let me explain. He looked at his children with something like hope in his eyes. Please. Claire and Marcus exchanged a glance. They'd come to bring him home, to drag him back to the world if necessary. But standing here in the room he'd built for their mother, looking at the evidence of his devotion and his skill and his transformation, going home suddenly seemed like the wrong answer. We'll stay, Claire said. We'll stay as long as you need us to. They stayed for 3 days. Claire and Marcus pitched their tent at the base of Jeremiah's tree and fell into the rhythm of his days, waking with the sun, eating simple meals, climbing into the canopy to help with whatever project he was working on. Marcus had his father's hands for carpentry, and he found himself falling easily into the work, measuring and cutting and fitting pieces together. Claire was less skilled but more determined, learning to tie proper knots, to sand wood smooth, to move through the trees without fear. In the evenings, they'd sit around the campfire and talk. Real talk, not the careful surface conversations they'd had for years. Jeremiah told them about the last year, the solitude, the building, the conversations he had with Sarah's memory. He told them about learning to hunt and fish, about the deer that came, to drink from the creek each morning, about the owls that nested in a neighboring tree. He told them about the hard days when grief had pinned him to his sleeping bag, and the good days when the work had lifted him out of himself. I'm not sad all the time anymore, he admitted on the second night. I'm not drowning. I'm not numb. I wake up, and I have purpose. I have this. He gestured at the tree above them, at the platforms barely visible in the darkness. I'm building something that matters. But you can't stay here forever, Claire said. Winter's coming. You'll freeze. You'll be trapped. And what about the ranch? What about... I bought this land, Jeremiah interrupted. The words hung in the firelight. Claire and Marcus stared at their father, trying to process what he'd just said. You what? Marcus finally asked. I bought it. 300 acres. Took most of my savings, but it's mine now, this tree, this forest, all of it. Jeremiah poked at the fire with a stick, not meeting their eyes. I filed the paperwork 4 months ago. It went through last week. Claire felt something cold settling in her stomach. You bought land. Out here, in the middle of nowhere. It's not nowhere to me. It's home now. What about the ranch? Claire's voice was rising. What about the house where we grew up, where Mom lived her whole life? You're just abandoning it. I'm selling it, Jeremiah said calmly. Or I will be. once I get around to listing it. Marcus, you wanted to know why I asked you to handle the financial stuff? That's why. I need you to sell the ranch and put the money in trust for you 3 kids. Split it even. It's yours. Marcus ran his hands through his hair. Dad, this is crazy. You can't just give up everything. I'm not giving up anything. I'm choosing something different. Jeremiah pulled a rolled paper from his jacket pocket and spread it on the ground between them. It was a detailed architectural drawing, sketched by hand but precise. This is what I'm building. Not just a treehouse, a whole compound. Living quarters, kitchen, storage, guest rooms, 12 major platforms connected by covered walkways. Solar panels for electricity, a rainwater collection system, a ground-level workshop and storage building. I've planned it all out. Claire leaned forward to study the drawing. It was elaborate, professional-looking, the work of someone who'd spent months thinking through every detail. Each platform was labeled with dimensions and purposes. Lines indicated water pipes and electrical conduits. Notes filled the margins, materials needed, construction timelines, weight calculations. This wasn't the sketch of a grieving man lost in fantasy. This was a real plan, a viable structure, a home. You're serious, she said quietly. You're actually planning to live here permanently. I am. Jeremiah met her eyes. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Except marrying your mother. But why? Why here? Why? This? Marcus gestured helplessly at the forest around them. You could come back to the ranch, could figure out a way to live with the memories. I don't want to live with the memories. I want to live inside the dream. Jeremiah's voice was firm but gentle. Your mother and I talked about building a treehouse for 40 years. It was our private joke, our someday plan, the thing we'd do when we finally had time. Well, I have time now, all the time in the world, and I'm doing it. I'm building the life we imagined. She's not here to enjoy it, Claire said, and regretted the words as soon as they left her mouth. But Jeremiah just smiled, sad and knowing. She's more here than she ever was at the ranch. Up in these trees, working with my hands, creating something beautiful. This is where I feel her. This is where she lives now. In every board I cut, every nail I hammer, every sunrise I watch from 60 feet up. She's in this place because I'm putting her here. Because I'm making her dream real. The fire crackled between them. Night sounds filled the forest, insects singing, branches creaking, the distant call of an owl. Claire looked at her brother and saw her own confusion reflected back. This wasn't the intervention they'd planned. This wasn't a lost old man who needed rescuing. This was a man who'd found something: purpose, peace, a way to live with grief that didn't involve drowning in it. Show us the rest, Marcus said finally. Show us everything you've planned. Over the next hours, Jeremiah walked them through his vision. He'd already completed 12 platforms and was working on a 13th. The drawings showed 24 total, enough for a small village in the trees. Some would be living spaces, others for storage or work. He planned to install a proper kitchen with a propane stove, a bathroom with composting toilet, even a library where he could store the books he planned to bring from the ranch. The solar panels would provide electricity for lights and a small refrigerator. The rainwater system would give him running water year-round. I've done the math, he said, pointing to calculations in the margins. I can live here comfortably for years, decades. If my body holds out, I'll still need to go to town for supplies sometimes, but mostly I can be self-sufficient. Hunt, fish, grow a garden in the clearing. I've already cleared a spot for vegetables next spring. You've thought of everything, Claire said, and she couldn't keep the wonder out of her voice. I've had a year to think, a year to plan, a year to figure out what comes next. Jeremiah rolled up the drawings. I know it seems crazy. I know you think I'm running away. But I'm running toward something, toward the life Sarah and I dreamed about, toward a place where I can breathe, toward work that makes me feel alive instead of empty. Claire stood and walked to the edge of the firelight, looking up at the treehouse silhouetted against the doof. Stars. She'd come here expecting to find a broken man, someone who needed saving. Instead, she'd found someone who'd saved himself, someone who'd taken grief and transformed it into something tangible and beautiful. Someone who'd kept a 40-year-old promise in the most literal way possible. "What about us?" she asked quietly. "What about your family?" "You're always welcome here," Jeremiah said. "Any of you, any time. This isn't me leaving you. This is me building something I can invite you into, something we can share. Your mother's gone, but this dream doesn't have to be. We can make it real together." Marcus joined Claire at the edge of the light. "Emily's going to freak out." "Emily will understand," Jeremiah said. "She was always the most like your mother. She'll see what I'm doing here." "And the ranch?" Claire asked. "You're really going to sell it?" "I am. It's time. That place was beautiful when Sarah was in it, but now it's just walls and memories. This," he gestured upward, "this is alive. This is growing. This is the future I'm choosing." Claire looked at her brother. They'd come to bring their father home, but home had changed. Home was no longer a ranch house in Montana. Home was a village in the trees, a cathedral built from grief and love and 50-foot Douglas firs. Home was wherever someone decided to put down roots, even if those roots were 60 feet off the ground. "Okay," she said, surprising herself. "Okay, but we're helping you finish it, and you're going to let us visit. And you're going to call Emily and explain all of this yourself, because I'm not taking that hit." Jeremiah laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. "Deal." They shook hands like business people sealing a contract, and then they were hugging again, the three of them, under stars that seemed closer than they'd been in years. The seasons turned again. Summer faded into fall, and Claire returned to Seattle, promising to come back in the spring. Marcus visited, twice more, bringing his boys for weekend camping trips where they'd climb into the trees and marvel at Grandpa's impossible village. Word spread slowly through the family, not that Jeremiah was lost, but that he'd been found, that he was building something extraordinary, that he was, against all expectations, okay. Emily came in October. She drove up from Billings on a Friday afternoon, following the directions Claire had sent, navigating the increasingly rough roads until she had to park and hike the last 2 miles. Jeremiah met her at the trailhead, having hiked down when Marcus called to say she was on her way. When she saw him lean and weathered and somehow more present than he'd been in years, she dropped her pack and ran to him. "Dad," she said into his shoulder, holding him tight. "I've been so worried." "I know. I'm sorry. But I'm okay. Better than okay." He pulled back to look at her. "You ready to see what your old man's been building?" The treehouse had grown significantly since Claire and Marcus's visit. More platforms, more walkways, actual rooms with doors and windows and furniture. The kitchen was functional now, with a propane stove and a sink connected to the rainwater system. One of the sleeping rooms had a real bed, not just a sleeping bag on boards. Solar panels were mounted on platforms that caught the most sun, and at night the lanterns glowed like stars among the branches. Emily stood at the base of the great tree and looked up, and tears ran down her face. "It's exactly like Mum's drawing." "That was the point," Jeremiah said softly. He took her up, showed her every room, explained every detail. Emily touched the carved railings, sat in the rocking chair that hung in Sarah's room, opened the music box, and listened to its tinny melody. She was quieter than her siblings had been, more thoughtful. When they finally settled on the main platform with coffee Jeremiah had made in his tree kitchen, she asked the question he'd been expecting. "Are you doing this for her, or for you?" Jeremiah considered the question seriously. "Both. I'm keeping a promise to her, but I'm also saving myself. After she died, I couldn't see a way forward. Everything felt pointless. But this," he gestured at the structures around them, "this gives me a reason to wake up. It gives me purpose." Do you talk to her? Emily asked. When you're up here working? Every day. I tell her what I'm building, what I'm planning. Sometimes I think I can hear her responding. Probably just the wind or my own imagination, but it helps. He looked at his youngest daughter. You think I'm crazy? I think you're grieving. I think you've found a way to do that which works for you, and that's not crazy. It's just different. Emily sipped her coffee. I brought something. From the ranch. I was going through Mom's things. I've been staying there on weekends, making sure everything's okay, and I found these. She pulled a bundle of letters from her jacket. Old envelopes, yellowed with age, bound with a ribbon. Jeremiah took them carefully, saw Sarah's handwriting on the outside of each one. The first was addressed to him, the second to Claire, the third to Marcus, the fourth to Emily. I don't understand, he said. She never sent them, Emily finished. I found them in her desk drawer, underneath some old bills. I think she wrote them years ago and just kept them. Maybe she forgot about them, or maybe she was waiting for the right time to give them to us. Jeremiah opened the one addressed to him with shaking hands. The letter was dated 15 years ago, written in Sarah's clear, careful hand. He read it slowly, and with each sentence, his understanding of his wife deepened. My dearest Jeremiah, it began, I'm writing this because there are things I need to say, and somehow it's easier to say them on paper than out loud. You know I'm not good with big emotional declarations. I get tongue-tied and teary and can't get the words right. But I need you to know some things, just in case. How proud she was of the family they'd built, the ranch they'd maintained, the love they'd shared. But there was more, too. Fears she'd never voiced. Worries about whether she'd been enough, done enough, given enough to him and their children. Dreams she'd kept quiet because they seemed impractical or selfish. I know we joke about the treehouse, she'd written, and maybe it's silly for a grown woman to want such a thing, but it represents something to me. Freedom, maybe, or possibility. Or just the idea that there's still magic in the world, still room for childish dreams, even when you're old and your back hurts and your children are grown. I want to believe we'll build it someday. I want to believe we'll have that time together, up in the trees, away from all the responsibilities and worries. I want to believe we'll be young again, even just for a moment. Jeremiah read the letter 3 times before he could speak. When he finally looked up, Emily was watching him with her mother's gentle eyes. She wanted this, he said, not just as a joke or a someday dream. She really wanted this. She did, and you're giving it to her. Emily reached across and squeezed his hand. You're giving it to all of us. This place, it's beautiful, Dad. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Over the following days, Emily helped her father work on the final major platform. This one would be the largest, a common space where people could gather, where family could come together. They framed walls and installed windows, sanded floors and built a long table where a dozen people could sit comfortably. Jeremiah worked with renewed purpose, Sarah's letter tucked in his shirt pocket, her words giving weight to every nail he hammered. The other letters were equally revelatory. The one to Claire spoke of Sarah's pride in her daughter's accomplishments, but also her sadness that Claire had felt she needed to leave Montana to become herself. I hope you know we never wanted you to feel trapped here, Sarah had written. We wanted you to fly, but I confess I missed you every single day. Marcus's letter talked about legacy, about watching him become a man and a father and seeing echoes of Jeremiah in everything he did. You have your father's steady heart, Sarah had written, his capacity for love that shows itself in action rather than words. I hope you know how special that is. And Emily's letter was the shortest, but perhaps the most powerful. You are my unexpected joy, Sarah had written. I thought I was done having babies, thought we were finished building our family. Then you came along and reminded me that life always has room for one more miracle. Thank you for being you, my sweet girl. Thank you for your gentle heart and your teacher's soul. The world needs More people like you. They read the letters aloud one evening, sitting around the campfire, passing them from hand to hand. Each letter was a gift, a message from beyond, Sarah's voice speaking to them one more time. And each letter reinforced what Jeremiah was doing here. He wasn't building a monument to grief. He was building a monument to love, to dreams deferred but not abandoned, to the belief that it's never too late to keep a promise. "We should finish it together," Emily said. "All of us, Claire and Marcus and me. We should be here when you complete the main structure." "It'll take another month at least," Jeremiah said. "Maybe 2. There's still so much to do. Then we'll come back. We'll take time off work. We'll bring the grandkids if they want to come. We'll make this a family project." Emily looked at her father with determination. "Mom wanted us to build this together. So let's build it together." Jeremiah felt something in his chest loosen, something that had been clenched tight since Sarah's death. His children were here. They understood. They saw what he was trying to do, and they wanted to be part of it. He wasn't alone in this anymore. He'd never been alone, really. He'd just been too deep in grief to see. "Okay," he said. "Okay, let's finish it together." They made plans that night. Claire would come back in 3 weeks. Marcus would bring his family for Thanksgiving, a Thanksgiving in the trees, with turkey cooked on the propane stove and gratitude spoken from platforms 60 feet up. Emily would stay through the weekend, helping her father with the common room and the walkways that still needed reinforcing. In Sarah's room, Jeremiah placed her letters beside the music box and the locket, a collection of memories, of love made tangible, of a life well lived. He wound the music box and let it play while he stood at the window, looking out at the forest that had become his home. The trees swayed in the autumn wind. Birds called from the canopy, and somewhere in all of it he could feel Sarah, not as a ghost, not as memory, but as something woven into the very structure of this place. She was in the boards and beams. She was in the careful joints and carved railings. She was in every corner of this impossible village he'd built among the branches. "Almost done," he said to her, to the wind, to the trees. "Almost done, my love, and it's going to be exactly what you dreamed." The music box wound down to silence. The forest sounds rushed in to fill the space. And Jeremiah knew, with certainty deeper than faith, that he was exactly where he needed to be, that everything that had brought him here, the love, the loss, the year of solitude and building, had been leading to this moment, to finishing what they'd started 40 years ago with a joke under a cottonwood tree, to keeping a promise that had seemed impossible until he'd made it real. The climax was coming, the completion, the moment when wood and vision would finally align into Sarah's dream made manifest, and his children would be there to see it, to help him finish it, to understand finally that some promises are worth keeping no matter how long they take. Thanksgiving came with the first snow. Light flurries that dusted the platforms and made the forest look like something from a storybook. Claire arrived first, driving up from Seattle with a trunk full of food and supplies. Marcus came next with Rebecca and the boys, who immediately wanted to climb everything. Emily had been there for a week already, helping her father with last-minute preparations. And in the morning, carrying a stone wrapped in cloth, Jeremiah would lay the foundation for the final platform. The stone was from the ranch. Jeremiah had driven back in October, his first return since he'd left, and walked the property one last time. The house was empty, listed for sale, already feeling like a place that belonged to someone else. He'd gone to the garden where Sarah had spent so many hours and found a smooth river stone she'd used to mark the tomato plants. He'd carried it back to the forest, and now it would become the foundation stone for the central platform. A piece of their old life built into their new dream. "Dad, where do you want the turkey?" Claire called from the kitchen platform. She was wrestling with a 20-pound bird and losing. "Let it thaw in the sink," Jeremiah called back. "We'll cook it tomorrow. Tonight we eat simple." They gathered on the common room platform as the sun set. 15 people squeezed around the long table Jeremiah and Emily had built. Claire, Marcus, Emily, Rebecca, Marcus's 2 boys, Emily's husband and their daughter, and Jeremiah at the head. It was the most people who'd been in the treehouse at once, and the structure swayed gently with their combined weight, making the children giggle and the adults hold their breath. But the platform held. Everything held. Jeremiah had built this place to last. They ate venison stew Jeremiah had made, bread Emily had baked in the small oven, vegetables roasted over the propane stove. It was simple food, but it tasted like family, like coming home, like the end of a long journey. The lanterns cast warm light across their faces. Outside the windows, snow continued to fall, soft and silent. "I want to say something," Jeremiah said when the meal was finished. The table went quiet, all eyes turning to him. He stood, feeling the weight of the moment, the importance of what came next. "I want to thank you all for being here, for coming all this way, for understanding why I needed to do this." "Dad, you don't have to," Claire started, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish, please." He took a breath. "When your mother died, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd just wait around the ranch until it was my turn to go. Everything we'd built together felt empty without her. I couldn't see a future, couldn't imagine waking up day after day in a world where she didn't exist." Marcus reached across the table and gripped his father's hand. "But then I found her journal. I found that sketch, and I realized she'd left me something, not just a drawing, but a dream, a promise we'd made to each other, and I decided that if I couldn't have her, I could at least have this. I could build the life we'd talked about. I could keep the promise even if she wasn't here to see it." The children were quiet now, listening in a way they hadn't listened in years. The grandchildren, too, sensing the weight of what was being said, even if they didn't fully understand. "But what I learned up here, in this year and a half of building, is that I wasn't just building for her. I was building for me, for us, for our family. This place," he gestured at the wooden walls around them, at the platforms visible through the windows, "this place is proof that love doesn't end, that dreams don't die, that even when everything falls apart, you can build something new, something beautiful, something that lasts." Emily was crying now. So was Claire. Even Marcus had tears in his eyes. "Tomorrow morning, I'm going to lay the foundation stone for the final platform, the one that will complete the main structure, the one that makes this place what Sarah drew in her journal all those years ago. And I want you all there. I want you to be part of it, because this isn't just my dream anymore, it's ours. It's proof that the Briggs family knows how to build things that matter." He sat down heavily, suddenly exhausted. But Claire was standing, raising her glass of water. "To Mom, and to Dad, and to the most beautiful treehouse in the world. To Sarah," Marcus added, "and to keeping promises. To family," Emily said softly, "to being together." They clinked glasses around the table, water and juice instead of wine, but the toast was no less meaningful. The lanterns flickered, the snow fell. And in that moment, suspended in the trees with his children and grandchildren around him, Jeremiah felt something he hadn't felt since Sarah died. He felt complete. Tomorrow would bring the final platform. Tonight brought this family, love, the fullness of being together. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Dawn came cold and clear. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving everything glazed in white. Jeremiah woke early, climbed down to his camp, and retrieved the foundation stone. He unwrapped it carefully, holding the smooth river rock in his weathered hands. Sarah had touched this stone, had placed it in her garden year after year. Now it would become part of something permanent, something that reached toward the sky. The family gathered on the highest platform as the sun broke over the mountains. They stood in a circle around the spot where the final platform would be built, the keystone structure that would tie everything together. Marcus had his boys, one on each side. Claire stood with her arm around Emily. Rebecca held her daughter. 3 generations of Briggs standing together in the trees. "This stone is from your grandmother's garden," Jeremiah said, holding it up for everyone to see. "She used it to mark where things grew, where life happened. Now it's going to mark where we finish what she started." He knelt and placed the stone carefully in the center of the marked area. "Sarah, my love, we're keeping the promise. We're building your dream." For a moment no one spoke. The forest was silent around them, as if the trees themselves were listening. Then Emily knelt beside her father and placed her hand on the stone. "We love you, Mom." Claire joined them. Then Marcus. Then the grandchildren, one by one, until everyone had touched the stone and said their own private goodbye, their own word of love. When they stood again, Jeremiah's eyes were wet, but his voice was steady. "Let's build." They worked together, the whole family. Marcus and Jeremiah handled the structural beams, measuring and cutting and fitting them into place. Claire and Emily assembled the floorboards, their hands moving in sync. Rebecca kept the grandchildren busy with smaller tasks, carrying nails, organizing tools, sweeping up sawdust. Even the youngest, Marcus's 6-year-old, helped by handing his grandfather screws when asked. The work went faster with so many hands. What would have taken Jeremiah days took only hours. Beams went up, boards were laid, railings were installed. The platform took shape piece by piece, growing from the foundation stone outward like a tree growing from a seed. This was how barns were raised in the old days, Jeremiah thought. Communities coming together to build something too big for one person alone. He'd built most of this place by himself, but this final piece, this was theirs together. By midday, the structure was complete. A platform 20 feet square, the largest in the entire treehouse village. From here, you could see all the other platforms, all the walkways and bridges, the whole impossible web of wood suspended in the ancient firs. This was the heart of it, the center, the place from which everything else radiated. "We need to mark it," Emily said. "Something permanent." Jeremiah pulled out his wood-burning tool, something he'd brought from the ranch months ago. He heated it over a small portable stove, then carefully burned words into the central beam, the one that supported everything else. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of 40 years and a love that had survived even death. Sarah and Jeremiah's someday house. Built 2024. Love never ends. Claire read the words aloud, her voice breaking. "It's perfect, Dad. It's finished," Jeremiah said, and the words felt both triumphant and sad. Finishing meant the journey was complete. Finishing meant there was nothing left to chase, no excuse to wake up each morning with singular purpose. But finishing also meant he'd done it. He'd kept the promise. He'd built Sarah's dream. Marcus's boys were running from platform to platform now, their laughter echoing through the trees. Rebecca was taking pictures, documenting everything. Emily stood at the edge of the new platform, looking out at the forest, stretching away in all directions. Claire came to stand beside her father. "She would have loved this," Claire said quietly. "She would have thought you were insane, but she would have loved it." "I am insane," Jeremiah admitted with a slight smile. "But I'm also right. This is exactly what we needed. What I needed. What maybe all of us needed, proof that love can build something real." They stood together in silence, father and daughter, watching the light move through the trees. The structure swayed gently in the wind, a constant, subtle motion that felt like breathing. Like the treehouse itself was alive, was part of the forest, was home to something more than just wood and nails. "Thank you for coming," Jeremiah said. "Thank you for understanding." "Thank you for building it," Claire replied. "Thank you for showing us that it's never too late. That promises matter. That love," her voice caught, "that love really doesn't end." The family gathered on the new platform as the sun began its descent. They stood together, 3 generations, in a treehouse built from grief and love and the stubborn determination of a man who refused to let his wife's dream die with her. Below them, the forest floor was 60 feet away. Above them, the sky was infinite. And around them, suspended in the branches of ancient trees, was proof that sometimes the impossible becomes real if you're willing to build it board by board, nail by nail, day by day. The dream was complete, the promise was kept, and the treehouse stood as testimony to what love could create when given time and wood and willing hands. Spring came to the forest with green fire. The trees burst into new growth, and Jeremiah's village in the canopy seemed to grow with them, as if it had always been part of this place, as if the forest had simply made room for one more kind of life. The treehouse had survived its first winter, the snow, the ice, the winds that made the platforms sway like ships at sea. Everything held, everything endured. The ranch sold in March to a young couple with 2 children and dreams of raising cattle. Jeremiah drove down for the closing, signed the papers, and handed over the keys without ceremony. The money went into trust for his children as planned, split 3 ways, enough to give each of them security and options. He kept only what he needed to maintain his forest compound, to buy supplies, to continue the work, because the work was never truly finished. There were always improvements to make, details to add, platforms to extend. But now he had help. Claire came twice a year, bringing Seattle rain stories and cases she was working on. She'd spend a week at a time up in the trees, working, alongside her father, asking him questions about his life she'd never thought to ask before. They talked about Sarah, about the early years of the ranch, about choices made and paths not taken. Claire learned that her father had wanted to be an architect once, that he'd given up that dream to take over his parents' ranch. That maybe this treehouse was his way of becoming what he'd always meant to be. Marcus brought his family every summer. The boys were fearless in the trees now, climbing and exploring with the confidence of youth. They'd named some of the platforms Dragon's Roost for the highest one, Owl's Nest for the one where barn owls had taken up residence, Rainbow Room for the space with all the stained glass windows. Marcus helped his father build a zip line between 2 distant platforms, and the sound of children's laughter became as much a part of the forest as birdsong. Emily came most often. She'd taken a summer position as a part-time ranger in the area, which gave her excuse to visit every few weeks. She brought books for the library Jeremiah was slowly filling, and they'd spend evenings reading in comfortable silence, each lost in their own worlds but together. She understood what this place meant to him in a way the others didn't quite grasp. She'd inherited her mother's intuitive heart, her ability to see past the surface to the truth beneath. "Do you still talk to her?" Emily asked one evening, sitting in Sarah's room while rain drummed on the roof. "Every day," Jeremiah admitted. "Though I don't know if she answers or if I'm just hearing what I need to hear. Does it matter?" He thought about that. "No, I suppose it doesn't. The comfort is the same either way." By the second summer, the treehouse had become something of a local legend. Hikers would occasionally stumble across it and stare up in wonder at the village in the canopy. Jeremiah would wave to them from above, sometimes invite them up for coffee if they seemed kind. He told them the story, the promise, the grief, the building. Most people left with tears in their eyes and a new understanding that love could take strange and beautiful forms. A magazine writer came in the fall, wanting to do a story. Jeremiah almost said no, but Claire convinced him. "Let people see what you built, Dad. Let them know that it's never too late to keep a promise." So he let the writer come, let him photograph the treehouse and interview the family. The article ran in a national publication with the headline, "Love Among the Branches, a widower's cathedral in the trees." After that, letters arrived. People from across the country writing to say the story had moved them, had inspired them, had reminded them that grief didn't have to be an ending. An elderly woman in Florida wrote that she'd started painting again after her husband died, something she hadn't done in 40 years. A man in Maine built a boat in his backyard, fulfilling a promise he'd made to his late wife. The treehouse became more than just wood and nails. It became a symbol of how love persists, how dreams can be realized even when the person you dreamed them with is gone. On the anniversary of Sarah's death, Jeremiah climbed to the highest platform at dawn. The family was coming later, all of them, plus some of the grandchildren's friends, plus Emily's husband's parents, who wanted to see this miracle they'd heard so much about. But this moment was for him and Sarah alone. He stood at the railing and watched the sun break over the mountains, painting the sky in colors she'd loved. The forest stretched out below him, endless and ancient and alive. Somewhere a hawk called. Wind moved through the branches with a sound like breathing, and Jeremiah felt her not as a presence exactly, but as something woven into the very fabric of this place. She was in every board he'd cut, every nail he'd driven, every detail he'd crafted with hands that still wore his wedding ring. "We did it, Sarah," he said to the wind, to the trees, to the morning. "We built our someday house. I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry you're not here to see it. But I hope wherever you are, you know that I kept the promise. I kept it the only way I knew how," the wind answered, moving through the treehouse like a sigh. The platform swayed gently. Somewhere far below, he heard voices, his children arriving, bringing food and laughter and life. The treehouse was no longer his alone. It had become what Sarah had always dreamed, a place for family, for gathering, for love to take root and grow, even in the most impossible circumstances. Jeremiah looked down at his hands. Weathered, scarred, strong. Hands that had built a ranch, raised children, and created a cathedral in the trees. Hands that still had work to do, still had platforms to improve, still had small touches to add to make this place complete. But the main promise was kept. The dream was real. And the love that had built it would endure. Long after his hands finally stilled, he descended to meet his family, his heart full in a way it hadn't been since Sarah died. The grief was still there, it would always be there. But now it lived alongside something else. Joy, purpose, the certainty that he'd transformed sorrow into beauty, loss into legacy. And in the trees above him, suspended between earth and sky, stood proof that some promises are worth keeping, no matter how long they take or how impossible they seem. The treehouse would stand for generations. The love that built it would last even longer. And somewhere, somehow, Sarah knew